Well, we're just gonna kind of share some of the things that we do on our farm to kind of increase these things that we think help us increase our likelihood of having heavy test weight oats, or basically meeting the milling quality. Basically, long story short, it's all pretty much about test weight. So, but just kind of a little bit of a background, just so you kind of know a little perspective on where I'm coming from when I talk about different things. Like I said, my name is Ben Dwire, and I farm with my wife, Christy, in southwestern Minnesota. We live in Arco, Minnesota. We're just pretty much west of Marshall, not too far from the South Dakota border on the Buffalo Ridge. And we raise oats, rye, corn, soybeans, and then we have a cattle operation. Just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective here, our small grains, generally we like to keep our farm into 1/3. So 1/3 of our acres are always going to be in small grains, and it's pretty much all oats that are designated for the food grade market. And then we do a few acres into cereal rye for a cover crop seed. And then 1/3 of it's going to be corn. And then the last 1/3 will be soybeans. And the soybeans are also they're conventional food grade soybeans also. So just kind of like I said, our farm, we are 100% no-till. We're 7 years of no-till going on our eighth year. So it's just something I kind of ask, you kind of want to keep in mind sometimes when you listen to how guys are doing things, that kind of makes a difference, what your tillage practices are. I would say 90% of the things that we do, I would think they would apply to any situation. But I just figured I'd mention, just so you kind of keep that in mind. We also put 2/3 of our farm goes into cover crops. Cover crops are a real kind of major component to our system, and it's actually a really major component to our oat system. We will always we're going to interseed, usually anywhere from 8 to 10 pounds of cereal rye with our oats, with the goal being growing as much of our own nitrogen for the following corn crop. So we're trying to raise a food grade crop, but we're also trying to provide some nutrition for next year's corn crop and reduce some inputs. But following harvest, we will usually no-till a few more species of cover crop in there, because we will run cattle on those acres. So we'll try and, it depends on the season and what Mother Nature has in store, but we will usually try and run cattle over those acres also. Then we no-till our corn into that green cover crop in the spring. We'll put cereal rye after corn harvest, and then we no-till soybeans into that green cover crop of cereal rye. So just kind of a little overview, just so you kind of know where we're going, or where we're kind of coming from. So I guess, Beth covered a lot of this stuff a little bit, but, the number one, probably the first stop and the biggest thing to stop and spend time on is variety selection. This is one of those areas where it doesn't cost you any more money to do the research and to pick the correct varieties that'll fit for you, but it's going to get you, it's going to get you 60% of the way to where you want to be just by picking the right varieties. Just going to mention too, all of the pictures on the slides that I have on here, these are all from our own farm. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what we do too. This particular picture is actually a picture of Minnesota Pearl. And I'm going to go into detail a little bit more of some of the considerations that we do, but I can tell you guys all the factors that we consider, but if you don't know where to find it, it doesn't get you very far. So I just want to kind of start by saying we use a lot of university research data when we kind of look at their trials to help us kind of sort through which varieties we like. University of Minnesota has a lot of really great information. I'm always looking forward to when that data gets published, and that's a really great starting block for most people. I also will follow that up. I like to look at South Dakota State University. They have a really great breeding program as well. A lot of good data there. And then I like to look at North Dakota State University. And I'll usually try and find a handful of different trials. And if certain varieties are sticking their heads up repeatedly in different areas, then I know it's something that's I feel pretty confident in using that variety. So that's where we start with, is a lot of that. There's a lot of good information out there, but I like to, if you can, I like to look at the 3-year trial data. It's because we always have those one-off years where a variety might have a great year or a poor year. So just kind of where we get our information. But obviously, number one selection criteria is going to be test weight. You know, if you are looking at different varieties and you're seeing that you got an oat that's going to average 27, 28 pounds in a lot of different tests, that's not one I'm probably going to give any consideration to. I'm going to look for oats that are consistently going to be 34 to 36 pounds at least. If it's higher, that's even better. But, you know, there's always a few things you can do to tease a couple more pounds out of it to get to that 38-pound test weight that we're shooting for. But yeah, that's your number one, is look at the test weight before I even look at yield. I do that. And then we follow that up with yield. Obviously bushels is what we get paid on. So you want to try and, you know, find a good balance between that heavy test weight, but yet it's going to get you enough bushels to be worth putting those, you know, those acres into that crop. Right after that, I guess we're going to really look hard at trying to find varieties that are resistant to rust, or at least as resistant to crown rust as we can find. In our area, crown rust is a really, really big disease that we fight with. It's out here, we're pretty much guaranteed we're going to see it in the summer. You know, when we had a couple years back and we had all that prevent plant and everybody planted Jerry oats, I mean, the fields by late July, early July, in that range, they were just orange. You could see it from the roads. I mean, it was just, we're really in a rust prone area. So that's a trait we're going to look pretty hard at. And even if you find a good variety that's not as rust resistant, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. It just means, you know, you better be prepared to do a few more extra steps, maybe a little more field site when you choose it, or maybe prepared to do a couple more applications of fungicide. For sure, you probably want to do fungicide at that point if it is pretty susceptible. But that's moving into the next two. My next two things that we really look at when we're these 2, 4, and 5 here are kind of two different roads to get to the exact same location. And the percent plumps and low percent thins is something that South Dakota State puts on their data, but really try and look for something that's going to be as high percent of plumps or mids and a low percent of thins. You know, if you're looking at something with the 9, you know, a lot of the good ones are around that 9% thins. You get a couple that are getting at 17 to 18. You probably don't want to look at those as much. Main thing is, because when we're harvesting, one of the things that we can do is turn up the air as far as we can, turn that fan speed up on our combine. So the higher percentage of thins you have, that's all getting blown out the back. So, you know, if you're looking at a 9 versus a 17, that's 8% of your, you know, of your oats that you're going to blow out the combine right off the bat on day one, just because it's going to have a higher percentage of thins. It's, you know, lower seed counts per pound is kind of another way of looking at that. If it's going to have 13,500 seeds per pound as opposed to 16,000, well, you can pretty much bet that that's going to be a really fat, heavy kernel that's going to stand up to the wind and kind of sort itself out. So, you know, that's another consideration just from a management standpoint that I like to really look at. If you look at the picture of the Minnesota Pearl up here, you can see, I mean, that was directly out of the bag, putting it in the drill, but those are really big, fat, plump kernels. That's been a variety that we've really liked. It kind of covers a lot of our bases. We used some Rushmore last year. Rushmore, that's a good one too. I don't really have much bad to say about that. But anyways, moving on to straw strength. That's kind of another thing to keep in your mind. I know there's a lot of considerations here, but if you are trying to grow really heavy oats and high yielding oats, there's a lot of top weight on the top of that plant. So you got to make sure you have something with some decent straw strength. Otherwise, you're going to have oats laying on the ground. And anybody that's ever had to combine lodged oats will tell you it's just a whole lot of not fun. I've had to combine fields 3 different directions trying to pick them up, and it'll ruin your day in a hurry. So if you can kind of help mitigate that on the front side, it'll make a lot more pleasant experience. And then the last thing is maturity. Guys don't usually think about maturities of oats, but it's something to look at. Usually, I'm not really too afraid with doing a full season oats like Pearl or Dion. But the reason I bring up maturity is a couple years back, we got into a situation where we were all the way back into May. Usually you're trying to plant those oats as soon as available, you can get in the field. If you start getting too far into May, but we had those acres contracted, well, then it was time to start looking at an earlier maturing variety because we didn't want to get too late into the season. So we ended up switching to Shelby that year. That one's a good oat, but I think it's kind of getting phased out. It's a pretty susceptible to rust. But now a good option if you need an earlier one would be Rushmore. That's a couple days earlier than Pearl. But that's kind of where we start with that. Kind of moving into the next thing we're going to think about is, field selection when you're trying to figure out what fields you're looking at. On our particular farm, we are not, we're in a 1/3 rotation. So I don't particularly go out and say this field's oats this year and this one is beans. We are pretty much, if it was soybeans last year, it's going to be a small grain this year. We're in that rotation where every acre's getting its share of rotation. So, the only thing is we're always going to follow with soybeans as opposed to corn. That just gives you one more advantage. Corn can just harbor a few more diseases, kind of increase your chance of some of those plant diseases as opposed to corn, because you're following a warm season grass with a cool season grass. So we're trying to break up that cycle. It's not to say that you can't do it. You certainly can. There just going to be a few more management things I think you'd want to think of, like you might need to put a tiny bit more nitrogen because of the residue on top, probably, and the carbon that you have on there with the corn stalks. Also, you're going to really want to consider fungicide, or especially look into your variety for resistance. But that brings me to my next thing is, as far as like drainage and soil type, I guess I'm not necessarily talking particular about, is it tiled or not? What I'm getting at here is, like on our farms, if I have a sandy light ground, that's going to probably get all of my cereal rye acres, just because it does better there. But if you're looking at your farm and you're like, okay, well, I'm only going to do 20 or 30 acres of oats this year. If you have a field that was in soybeans last year that we all have them, this field is going to be the one that I can get into first. That field is the one that's going to be last. Try and pick your one that you can get into first with your oats, because the earlier you can get it seeded, the better, the further ahead you are. Because the whole name of the game is you want to try and get that plant to flowering and head fill ahead of the hot time of the year. So the earlier you can get in. So if you have fluctuations where you can kind of pick which fields, try and choose one that you can get into earlier. On the flip side, from a management choice, if you have a couple of fields that are good, but they struggle come August where you run out of rain, those are good ones to put into small grains as opposed to corn, because your plant is done. You've got your harvest off by the middle to late July usually. So, we use it as a strategy that way, just to kind of help with moisture resources. And then the final thing to think about, I guess, is if you are considering grazing like we do, you might want to, if you're going to pick a field over the other, if you have proximity to your yard where you have water access, maybe you have one that already has a fence around it. If maybe it is or is not on a major highway, could be a consideration. A lot of those little things, but that's just something that you can kind of consider if it's going to be part of your system. So this part here, I'm just going to, this, obviously I'm not an agronomist, so this is not a recommendation by any means. I'm just kind of telling you, just as a point of reference, of what we do on our farm for fertility. Kind of goes without saying, but if you can soil test your fields, that is always that's always really helpful, because exactly what you've got out there. You might not need to apply as many nutrients if you know that you have a lot. And on the flip side, you may find, okay, I'm struggling on this field. Oh, look, she's low on sulfur. We might want to address that problem. It's obviously frozen right now, so it's a little more challenging. So probably if it's not, it might not be applicable this year, but it does help. The last 2 years, we've been doing a 50-40-40 type of a program where we're getting 50 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus and 40 pounds of potassium. And we broadcast that right ahead of planting. That's one of the beautiful things about oats is they don't take as much fertilizer as corn does. So it's kind of nice to be able to cut back on a few acres like that, especially on a year when it's really expensive. We have gone as low as we used to. When we first started, we were just doing a 30-30-30. And that wasn't too bad either. You see the 15 on the end there, that's sulfur. We've been putting 15 pounds of sulfur. Our soil tests are showing us that we have been, we're starting to run kind of low on sulfur. So actually that number might be more like 15 to 25 pounds we're going to put just to kind of help. Because on lighter, sandier soils, they say oats really have that extra sulfur on them. So, but like I said, you kind of got to there's a fine line between you want enough nitrogen to get good yield and heavy test weight. But if you go too far, you're going to have some issues with lodging because oats will get really tall if you just go wild on it. So I guess, in a nut, with that, when we look at what we have for soil biology and with our kind of our cover cropping system we have, we're kind of crediting as much as 25 pounds that the soil is basically providing us. So in reality, we're probably looking at supplying more like 75 pounds of nitrogen out there. And so far, that's been a pretty good number for us to get us to where we want to be without having lodging issues. And then just kind of mention, like, because we are no-till, we usually will treat both of our nitrogen and our phosphorus with some stabilizers because we're not incorporating it with tillage. So we are relying, on a very minimal level, we're relying on the drill to basically shove it in the ground a tiny bit. But more importantly, we're wanting the rain to kind of incorporate it some. So, we're going to treat it with something like Instinct. And these are just examples of what we use, but just to kind of help with volatilization so we don't have as much leaching of the nitrogen. And then I've been liking to use one of those fertilizer, those phosphorus treatments like a Veil. Basically, it's just going to make that phosphorus more plant available the first year. A lot of my soil tests might show that because we've done so much baling of corn stalks and straw in the past, which is something we're working away from for livestock. We've done a lot of baling of those acres. We're running really low on potassium and some of those things. Instead of going out and writing a huge check and putting 50 pounds on, we might put more like 40 pounds on and treat it, try to get more out of what we're putting on. So I guess that's kind of something we've been doing the last few years.
And there was a couple of questions that came up just on some of these topics. So your no-till drilling, are you pulling anything on the toolbar ahead of the grain drill? Or are you just drilling right into the stubble and going? Drilling
directly into stubble. So we've got a 5400 drill, Case IH, and it's got a Yetter Coulter cart on the front. So that Coulter cart is just kind of cutting a pre-slot ahead of the drill openers, but that's all we're pulling ahead of it. But I will tell you, the more years of no-till we do, the less, actually in the spring, I lock my Coulter cart up and it's just barely scratching the ground because after about 3 years, the ground gets so mellow. And usually in the spring, the ground is so soft, you hardly need much down pressure to get to where you need. So oats are really easy to no-till.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a good consideration to think about, especially from a soil health perspective. To avoid that, spring tillage pass can be pretty beneficial if you have the capability to do it. And then what do you typically target for a yield goal if you're putting out about 75 pounds in? What do you hope to get for yield?
We're generally going to shoot for about 110 to 120 pounds of oats. Mm-hmm. That's what we're shooting. Yeah, bushel. Or sorry, I said pound. I meant bushels. That wouldn't be too impressive in pounds. But yeah, we're shooting for about 110 to 120 bushels. In the back of we run in that program. The first year when I did the 30-30-30 blend, we hit 135 bushels that year. So I mean, with that fertility, you can run them quite a bit higher. So you kind of plan them for it, but yet you in the back of your mind, like maybe 150 if Mother Nature's kind.
Yeah, I mean that's always the X factor that comes into play with spring seeded small grains, is the weather can definitely influence yield and quality big time.
All right. Well, so then kind of the next thing we move into is our seeding rate that we use. And I guess, I kind of would encourage anybody to don't really think about your seeding rate in terms of, bushels per acre. I really like to think about it just like you do with your corn and your soybeans, think about it in seeds or plants per acre. So generally speaking, I try and shoot for that 1.2 to 1.3 million plants per acre as a final stand. So I'll go out afterwards and throw a square and I'll do stand counts in each of our fields just to kind of gauge how close we are. But when you're doing that, so when you're trying to figure out what your final stand is, you kind of got to work the equation backwards. You kind of, especially with no-till, you can probably plan on losing anywhere from 10 to 20% of the seeds that you start with, because this is where it's really important to know your germination on your seed tag when you're planting it, because sometimes you'll get lucky and you might get a batch of seed that's 90% germination. I've had them up to 95% germinations. That's just amazing. Sometimes it's down to 85 depending on the year. But, if you've got a difference between 95 and 85, there's a 10% difference in population that that you're not going to lose. So, you kind of got to work back from the system that way. Also, it's really important to know how many seeds per pound you have out there. That is a really, really important number, especially when we're talking about calibrating the drill here in a second. But I guess just to back up, but yeah, so generally, just as a reference, usually we're close to about 1.5 million seeds per acre was what we're going to start with, what we're going to drop in the field, which is probably going to be in that 3.5 to 4 bushel range. But so the reason this is underlined is this is one of those things that you can do for free that will pay you back so much. And you'll never be sorry you learn how to do this, but learn how to calibrate your drill. Every single drill book will tell you how to do it, but your drill box is probably going to be, it's a good reference as a starting point, but it's probably calibrated for something like 16,000 seeds per pound. So if you're at 13,000 seeds per pound, you're going to be way short of where you wanted to be, and you're not going to be happy with your stand. Also, because we are interseeding red clover, I actually mixed the clover and the oats in the box at one time, just kind of mix it real with our arms, basically, just kind of mix it by hand. But anytime you're adding anything to it, it's going to change the flow and everything. So it's really important to just take the time to calibrate your drill. And if you're doing cover crops, like I said, you'll never be sorry that you learned how to do it. And it doesn't take much more than a half hour to do that. So.
And Ben, what form of N are you applying? Is it urea or UAN?
Nope, it's urea. It's going to be mostly urea, but we're going to put ammonium sulfate in there too. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get some AMS, some fertilizer grade AMS, which is usually going to give us our sulfur that we need to. So it's going to be those two products.
Yeah, one of the unintended results of cleaning up the atmosphere is no sulfur from the rain. Do you ever do a late season N foliar at all, or can you comment?
So that, yeah, we're going to talk about that's something that we're going to actually try this year.
Okay.
We are actually looking at doing that when we make our fungicide pass. So yeah, so that is something kind of like a Coron type of a product. So that is actually something we're looking at doing this year. So. Okay, so here's kind of just some things just to kind of talk over some of the things that we do on our drills to kind of get it. I got a 20-foot drill. You can kind of see in the picture, but it's just like, think of it just like you are with your corn plant. You want to get as many seeds germinated and up out of the ground on the same day as you can. You don't want them popping up over the course of a week. So everything we're trying to do is either to thicken the stand or to get our germination as close together of a window as we can. So sharp openers is, with no-till, probably the most important thing you're going to do. And even if you're talking about corn planters or anything, that sharp openers was really a big deal. But, I guess I replace my openers every 2 years on our drill. But even more so, maybe it gets overlooked, but and I know it's not a fun thing to do, but making sure that your disc openers are shimmed and tight so you don't have any more gap than probably like a, you know, like a business card gap in between the two blades, is a really an important aspect, because if you have a gap, you're going to get a little ribbon of soil, probably going to be really fine, dry soil that's going to be getting into your seed trench. That's going to affect the depth that your seed's laying at. And it's also going to be putting that seed onto dry stuff. So you want to make sure that you're actually splitting that trench open and getting that seed right to where you want it. And you want to make sure you're, you know, if their blades are really worn, you're not going to be at the depth you want to be, and your down pressure is going to be off too. So that's a good starting point. Talking about, like I said, with the thick stand row spacing, obviously there's only so much you can do with that. You know, your drill's either going to be 6, 7, 8, whatever, 10 inches spacing. If you have an option, always try, and we always like to do the narrower the better. Mine is on 7-inch spacings. I guess we really like that. My dad's got an old International 620 press drill that's on 6-inch spacings, and he does. He's still on a tillage system, but that 6-inch drill just makes a beautiful stand when you get that thick of a, you know, or tight rows. It just really tillers and fills in nice, and then it goes a long ways for helping with weed suppression. So just gonna kind of, like I said, I'm not trying to advocate for one thing over the other, but these seed firmers, I've got a picture on them. These are Keaton seed firmers that we have on our drill. I'm just gonna be blunt. Of all the things we have done and spent money on our farm, this is probably the best payout, or one of the best payouts I've ever invested money on, period. We've tried some of the rebounders. Everything we're trying to do is get as many of the seeds germinated and up on time, but these seed firmers shove that seed all the way down to the bottom of the slot. From the very first time we put those on, we saw so much more of our seeds come all up on the first day. It was unbelievable. It came up like we do. It was like growing corn again. You know, it came up to, you know, you have expectations for corn that it's all going to come up in a tight window, but small grains, sometimes here's 1, here's 3, tomorrow's a few more. This really tightens up your window. And when you're getting into fungicide application and you're targeting your flag leaf, having it in a tight group makes a lot of difference with your success rate with that too. And then this is just a picture. This is another one that I'm going to put up there as something that we're pretty excited about. We did last year. We put a rolling basket on the back of our drill. We've tried a lot of different things, drag chains without anything behind other than the press wheels, but this really kind of helps any of the seeds that get flicked out, at least get them in the dirt or touching the soil. Really firms up behind the seed bed and makes it sound really nice and level, even in a no-till situation. So when you're spraying and combining, it's just beautiful. Part of the reason we put that on there is because we no-till our soybeans into cereal rye. So that was the main reason we did it, was to get that cereal rye flattened on the ground and covering the soil. This was more of a kind of a gravy or an added benefit, and they're not cheap, but that's one of them things that I'm pretty glad that I put it on there. It does add a lot of weight to your drill. I mean, you can tell she's back there. You got to have duals on the tractor when you're doing that. So,
Ben, there are several questions that came through about you know, aspects of seeding here. So when you're mixing the clover with your oats, are they going in a different box, or they all go together? Or?
No, I don't have different boxes. And well, like I said, we kind of do it cowboy math. I kind of know roughly. It's like I like to get, and I know a lot of people don't like this, I like to get bags of seed for that reason, because I'll figure out ahead of time, okay, I want X amount of pounds of oats mixed with so many pounds of red clover. We'll put in like a third of the box, mix it by hand, just like you're mixing, just tumble it around with your hands, you up to your elbows in there, do another layer and another layer. It's not an ideal situation, but it works really great. You know, but I don't have the small seed box. Otherwise, that would be probably the better way to go. But I don't have it on there. So.
Yeah, and I guess the thing with people with separate boxes is the small seed box just makes sure the seed doesn't get buried too deep, because those clover seeds, if they're deeper than a ½ inch, they just don't come out of there very well. But I mean, it might be a different scenario too with your no-till situation as well.
Yeah, because we've had good. Yep, I know. We've had good luck with it, but yeah, we're down at 1.5 inches. You know, but I think because it's coming up with the oats at the same time, you've probably got, you know, more soldiers pushing up at one time to break through. So probably follow some of that loosened up, you know. But probably throw a few more pounds of red clover out there for that reason also.
Do you ever drill into slightly frozen soil, or do you basically just go as soon as you can, or what's your
we go as soon as we can. If my brother's got a John Deere drill and that's got a lot more down pressure, that would be the way to go. If I had one of those with a single disc opener instead of a double disc, you can pretty much shove that into a parking lot. But no, we just kind of wait till the ground's firm and do it that way, or dried out enough.
And what do you use for a clover seeding rate?
We're usually about 8 to 10 pounds.
Okay. And then last question, kind of going backwards a little bit. Do you do any broadleaf herbicide spraying before
Yes.
or after? Or?
Yep. So we'll talk about that in a second here too.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah, yep. That is a major consideration, and I'll just kind of jump ahead with that. But we use what's called a product called Sword, and it's MPCA is what it is. They call it the old oat herbicide, but red clover and alfalfa both can tolerate that. So,
Okay.
But yeah, you have to make sure you have something that'll be able to not wipe it out, so it limits you quite a bit. So
Yeah, gotcha.
there we go. So we're kind of good transition. So with our no-till situation, probably one of our biggest weeds that we fight with is dandelions. And there's few things on this planet that I hate more than dandelions. And so one of the things that we have found out that goes a long way is fall burn down of the dandelions. Generally, it's something as simple as just 2,4-D and maybe a little bit of dicamba. But, that it's kind of like that. It goes so much further because you can control those perennials so much better in the fall. And, that's where when you're combining your soybeans, it's really nice to take notes of where you saw those weeds. Because if I'm out combining and I don't see any dandelions out there, I'm not going to go and spray it for fun. But I might be like, okay, this field, the end rows were terrible and that north hill was really bad, or that west side of the hill was really bad. So we'll just spot spray where we have issues. But because we don't have as many options with the red clover in there, it makes it a little more important that we try and get ahead of it in the fall so we don't have to deal with it in the spring. And like I said, we use Sword as our herbicide. And that has been a really good one for us. Also, if you are, just to mention, this is a time of year to think about it. If you are going to do some grazing or even haying, you kind of want to give some thought to which herbicides you're going to use, because there is some that have meat and milk withdrawals. So you kind of got to be thinking about that. Also, like a lot of guys in our neighborhood like to use Wide Match or Husky as a herbicide, or something with stinger in it. That'll really do a great job cleaning up weeds, but it's going to really limit what you can do for a cover crop afterwards. I mean, it'll still grow, but you might get some pretty ugly, spindly looking covers afterwards. So you just kind of, if you can make those decisions ahead of time and know your options now, as opposed to after the fact, your chances of success will be way better. And then kind of just going to follow into like that with our fungicide. Like I said, in our area, rust is a real major issue. So fungicide is pretty much a must for us, even though we pick varieties that are a little more on the resistant side. But one thing that we've found to be really, really important is that you've got to get out and spray it when it's at the flag leaf. I know my dad has done it at the same time. We've had the same varieties and half a mile apart, and he's gone and put it on with his herbicide application when it's about like at the 4-leaf stage. And, you need to be out there when the flag, because that flag leaf is the engine of your grain production out there on that plant. So you got it your whole goal at this point is to protect and keep that flag leaf healthy. So it's worth the extra trip to be out there just to cover that flag leaf. It can be it can be anywhere from 4 to 6 pounds for us if we don't do it. And I've seen that happen quite a few times. The downside is your window is very short. There's a lot of times where it seems like, you got to be scouting, but it seems like you got like a 4-day window between flag leaf emergence and head emergence, which is where it's really important to try and get your emergence of your seed timed right, because the more of them that come up at one time, the better job you can do. If you've got some that are not flag leafed yet. Half of them are flag leafed and half of them are starting to head out. That gets really hard to manage that. So, along with that too is, your sprayer tips you use makes a difference. We like to use the double fan tips usually on that. Something that's going to be a smaller droplet, and we're looking at some really good wide leaf coverage. We're not looking to use our air induction nozzles at that point, because I'm not trying to penetrate the canopy. We're just trying to get that top leaf covered really, really well. But while you're out there, like we talked about earlier, this is kind of your, before you get to harvest, this is kind of your, this is like being in the desert when you see that sign that says no more gas stations for 100 miles. This is that, this is your last opportunity to kind of get out there. You can hire an airplane, but it's like you're out there. If you see that you've got some nutritional diseases out there, you can do some foliar applications. You can get a little bit of nitrogen out there with it if you want to. You kind of gotta be careful with leaf burn on some of that, but also pest control. We have had years where we have really struggled with grasshoppers. I've seen grasshoppers take 30 bushels off of a field. And so you got to really watch them. If you're seeing something eating on the edges of those leaves, it's a good time to take care of that. You don't go spray it just because you're there. But like last year, we were putting fungicide on, and I happened to be that morning, went out and checked them, and I saw we had little grasshoppers over about the size of a mosquito. And luckily I was out there and checked before we went. And so we took care of those, and we did not have any grasshopper issues this year, but last year we struggled pretty bad with it. So, but it's a good opportunity. But fungicide, like I said, most important thing is that timing at flag leaf is, if you're not going to hit it there, I would venture to say it's probably not worth spending the money if you don't time it right.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice on that. We've seen that really, like you're commenting on, really making the difference for conventional oat growers, about significantly increasing quality for sure. Did you have a big rust issue last year? We didn't see a whole lot of it.
No, we didn't last year, but we were pretty excessive drought over here too.
Right.
But
yeah.
But the year before was pretty bad, and we were dry the year before too. So.
Mhm.
And then just kind of a couple more things here, that we this is kind of, at this point, you're, harvesting a couple different considerations. I have done both directions, swathing and straight cutting. I'll be honest with you. I can't say that I would call one better than the other. There's just different considerations with each one. Swathing, if you don't have fans on your grain bins, if you're going to be storing it, or if you're taking it to grain millers, usually I'm thinking they're going to want it to go through a sweat out in the field first, because it will go through a sweat in the grain bin. So, if you don't have that storage capacity or the option, then swathing is a really good way to cure it out in the field. Also, if you're going to bale it too for straw, you can usually swath it when it's a little bit greener and maintain a little more strength in that straw too. If you have, especially if you're going to be baling it and you're going to be cutting it close to the ground, either way, we've done it. If you have really humid weather and you're trying to straight cut it, but you're cutting all the way down to the bottom, it can really be a struggle to get it go through the combine. When it starts to get tough, you're going along and life is great. And next thing you know, it's wrapping around the reel and the combine's grunting and you plugged it up, and it goes from being great to terrible in about 10 seconds. When you're in that situation, if it is swath, it seems like you can get an extra hour out of the day, because it won't get tough and it'll dry out a little quicker than when it's straight, because that waxy stem will really hold moisture for a long time into the day. But if it's very wet or the opposite, very dry, I like to straight cut it, because we had one year we had 10 inches of rain on the windrow and it sprouted, and at that point you can't even take it to the elevator once it starts to sprout. You just got to find some cattle to feed it to. So if you're in a wet spell, sometimes it's safer just to straight cut it. Or like this year, it was so dry that the oats got so brittle that if you hit it too hard, those seeds started shaking out. So at that point, we're like, let's just eliminate our losses and straight cut it. And it went pretty good. One of the advantages though of straight cutting is if you're not going to bale, you can cut just below the heads. and leave more straw height out in the field, then you don't have to worry about the humidity or, as much, because you're not running the entire plant through. So it's not going to plug up quite so bad. But like I said, you're going to want to have a fan on. But probably the most important thing when you're combining, and you'll hear it over and over, is turn up the fan speed as far as you can handle going, and blow the light. That's where we get back to that variety selection. We're having those ones that have the heavier seeds, or the fewer amount of thins in there, can really save you a lot of stuff blowing out the back of the combine. This is where you bring your moisture tester with you, and you start checking, and you mess with your fan until you get her set right. And, you kind of got to try and find that happy balance between, because, you're shooting for 38 pounds. So maybe we're going to shoot for 36 to 37 right at the combine, because I can get an extra pound or two afterwards, just when it goes through a sweat and running it through some augers and things. But you don't want to go too overboard where you're blowing too much out just to get up to 40 pounds, because that's all money blowing out the back of your combine. So you kind of got to try and find that sweet spot that's going to work for you there. And just kind of like I said, just when it comes to storage and handling, like I said, if you straight cut it, if you have the option to put a full air floor on there, that can really help, because it will go through a sweat in the grain bin. So that helps a lot. One thing we do that's really doesn't cost a lot of money, it's a little bit more monkeying around, but I like to run it through several augers to get the test weight up. So we'll dump it. I don't need to, but we'll dump it in the grain cart and then dump it in the truck, just to kind of shine it up and run it through a few more augers. And then I myself will dump it in the dryer bin. And we're not going to run heat on it, but I like to use that dryer fan because there's so much airflow. And then we'll run the stirrators just to try and get as much dust and chaff blowing out the top of the grain bin as possible, and to help it get through that sweat. It's not like corn and soybeans where you're really worried about cracking like you are with corn, through an auger. Here you want to try and break that tip off a little bit of the oat plant, just to kind of get that test weight and blow that stuff off. And then when I'm done, I will actually run it all the way down the cross augers and dump it in the last bin, just to run it through another auger, just to kind of try and get a little more shined up, if you will. And then once I've got enough air in that last bin, then I can turn the air on in that one. While I'm filling it, I'll run the air just to try and blow as much dust off the top as we can. And then just kind of your last stop, on there is if you have a grain vac. That's kind of the last trick that a guy has in the toolbox to use. And that can help. You can get an extra pound out of it sometimes by using a grain vac. I don't have one, so I have to rent one. So if I don't have to do it, I won't. But it is an option, and it does help. It's just make sure you dump out the canister on the filter, because it'll fill up fast. So, yeah. Just kind of to recap, these are kind of, like I said, the 5 main things that, we kind of try and do to just increase our test weight. Like I said, oat variety, that's the biggest part of your battle. For us, fungicide, if it's at the flag leaf, is a real big deal. High fan speed on the combine, run it through as many augers as we can, and grain vac. It's raising food grade oats is a really fun challenge, and it seems kind of daunting, but it's very obtainable. There's no reason that guys can't. It's really not that difficult, but it's something that we kind of enjoy doing. And when you're raising a product that goes to human consumption, it's kind of as a farmer, it's kind of one of those higher calling things that you just kind of take a lot of pride in. So, and just kind of a parting thought, I'm sure you guys have heard this all before, but, with adding small grains into the rotation, there are so many, like, if you want to call them gravy, that comes along that, I like to say oats is the crop that makes everything else look better. Sometimes oats get beaten on because it's not always $6.50 a bushel. And sometimes it's, $3 oats when you can raise $6 corn or $5 corn. It's kind of a tough push. But, there's a lot of added benefits, straw sales, there can be up $80 to $100 an acre worth of straw sales out there. That's something we're kind of starting to shy away from, just because we ran our potassium levels down to a level that I'm not real comfortable with anymore. But also there's a lot of cover cropping options. It gives you an opportunity to do some real good heavy lifting on the soil health front. Because you got a full season cover crop, you can do some really cool things. And if I guess I would just encourage anybody that's looking at raising oats this year, please don't let that ground just sit there and get fat and lazy. but it wants to work. It wants to do things for you. You can grow your own nitrogen by putting a legume, but I hate to see guys waste an opportunity because that land wants to do something and you got a real window to work there. And then, grazing livestock's another opportunity there too. This picture of these cows, that was taken right around Thanksgiving last year. These are actually some custom grazing cows that we took on this year because I didn't need as many acres of cover crops as we had. There's guys that would be happy to fence it in, that'll bring their own livestock and take care of it for you. And if nothing else, like for us, this covers the cost of the seed. And we get the benefits of the livestock impact and soil health. My neighbor gets the reduced feed costs. It's a really good win-win situation. And then, it just gives you that nice crop rotation. Most of our crops that we raise are all conventional. It's a lot easier to cut out some of those traded products when you have a 3-crop rotation. So.
That's awesome information.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to jump in there. Nope. We had a question come up, a gentleman from Canada, and running the crop multiple times through augers will affect germination. Obviously, we're kind of talking at two different purposes here because Ben's running for milling versus seed. But I mean, we typically don't see a lot of, like Ben was mentioning, oats can handle a little bit more handling and augering without damaging, as long as they're not super duper dry. But we really haven't seen any big issues. I don't know what your thoughts are.
And that's actually a good point. To be clear, I don't save any seed back. That's I used to 4 years back. I used to sell with my dad, sell some seed corn and soybeans. And I guess it's kind of one of them things that I'm like, I personally would rather leave the seed cleaning and raising to the professionals. I'm just going to focus on grazing, food grade oats. But, you always get those things, like you said, if you run through too many augers, you might have some hairline cracks in the seed or something, there's I just would rather let somebody else worry about the germination and, and all the seed prep and just buy it in the bag and worry about my end. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, I really appreciate all the information. This has really been helpful and instructive for me. Just seeing what you're doing on your farm, and I'm sure a lot of other people on today have had similar takeaways. It's just really interesting to see, how you operate your farming operation and how much thought there is into every step. And I especially like the kind of the parting slide too, about how many other benefits can come from incorporating a 3rd crop. And I think without editorializing too much, I think we've heard that refrain, quite a few times, that we're not just talking about the added benefit of potentially, adding a crop that you can get $6 or $7 a bushel from, but it provides windows for, seeding cover crops and, holding your soil in place and, potentially opening up opportunities for selling straw, maybe custom grazing a neighbor's cattle. It really opens up your toolbox quite wider than just having 2 crops in your rotations. It's kind of a cool place to take it.
And then one more thing to add on there is there's also tremendous wildlife benefits. We rent a lot of our ground, and a lot of my landowners are wildlife enthusiasts. When you have a field of lush green cover crops, like some of our farms, we don't graze, that we leave for wildlife, for winter feed sources for the deer. When you get to November and everything is brown and you have a field of really nice lush cover crops, you can about guess where the deer is going to be at. So, so there's some benefits with that too. So.
Yeah, and it's easy to see the thread too. I'm assuming after you've been doing this for multiple years too, about how much benefit having that 3rd crop lends to your corn and soybeans years as well.
I feel like I don't have any real hard, but it seems like usually about 10 to 15 bushels you can add to your corn crop by following it by oats.